Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck became known as the Lonely Hearts Killers. Between 1947 and 1949, they used personal ads in newspapers to find lonely women. They would seduce them, rob them, and then take their lives. They were convicted of one case but confessed to 3. Police suspected them in up to 20 deaths. Both were put to death at Sing Sing Prison in New York on March 8. Raymond Martinez Fernandez was born on December 17, 1914 in Hawaii. His parents were Spanish immigrants who moved to Connecticut when he was young. Raymond was a smart man. He worked for British intelligence during World War II. In 1945, he was working on a ship when he suffered a serious head injury. A hatch door fell on his skull. After that incident, people said he changed. He became obsessed with voodoo and black magic. He started using personal ads to meet vulnerable women. He would pose as a wealthy man looking for love. Once he gained their trust, he would steal their money and disappear. Martha Jewel Beck was born on May 6, 1920. She worked as a nurse at a hospital in Florida. She was overweight and insecure about her appearance. She had been married twice before and both marriages failed. She had 2 children. In 1947, Martha responded to a personal ad. The ad was from Raymond. They exchanged letters for weeks. He told her he was a successful businessman. She fell in love with him through those letters. When they finally met in person, Martha was obsessed. She abandoned her children and moved in with Raymond in New York. She discovered his con artist schemes, but she did not care. She wanted to be with him no matter what. She became his partner. The scheme changed after Martha joined. Raymond would still seduce lonely women through personal ads, but Martha's jealousy turned the operation deadly. She could not stand to see him with other women. When Raymond got close to his targets, Martha would become violent. Their first confirmed individual affected was Myrtle Young in August 1948. Myrtle was a widow from Pennsylvania. Raymond had convinced her to marry him. Martha became enraged. Myrtle was found deceased on a bus ride. The death was ruled as natural causes at the time. On January 4, 1949, they targeted Janet Faye. Janet was a 66-year-old widow from Albany, New York. Raymond had been writing to her for weeks. She trusted him completely. She gave him $4,000 in cash along with jewelry and bonds. Martha and Raymond took Janet to a house on Long Island. Martha became jealous when Raymond paid attention to Janet. On January 3, Martha attacked Janet with a hammer. Raymond finished the job by strangling her with a scarf. They buried her body in cement in the basement. Their next targets were Delphine Downing and her 2-year-old daughter Raynell. Delphine was a 41-year-old widow living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In February 1949, Raymond arrived at her home pretending to be her pen pal. He brought Martha along and introduced her as his sister. Delphine welcomed them into her home. On February 28, Raymond shot Delphine in the head while she slept. The firearm was a .32 caliber. Little Raynell would not stop crying. She kept asking for her mother. Martha drowned the child in a washtub. Neighbors became suspicious when Delphine and Raynell disappeared. They called the police. On March 1, 1949, officers arrived at the home with a search warrant. Raymond and Martha tried to act normal, but the police did not believe them. They searched the basement and found both bodies. The couple was arrested immediately. They confessed to the deaths of Janet Faye, Delphine Downing, and Raynell Downing. Because Michigan had abolished the death penalty, they were extradited back to New York to stand trial for Janet Faye's case. The trial began in June 1949. It lasted 44 days and became a media sensation. Martha testified that she was so in love with Raymond that she would do anything for him. The jury deliberated for over 12 hours. On August 18, 1949, both were found guilty of first-degree offense. The death sentence was mandatory under New York law at that time. Governor Thomas Dewey denied their appeal for clemency. On March 8, 1951, they were both put to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison. Raymond went first, Martha went second. She reportedly weighed over 200 pounds, and the executioners had trouble strapping her into the chair. Their story became one of the most infamous in American history. 2 people so twisted by jealousy and greed that they caused the deaths of innocent women just trying to find companionship.
Ray and Faye Copeland looked like any other elderly farming couple in Mooresville, Missouri. But behind the quiet life on their small farm sat one of the most calculated schemes in history. Between October 1986 and May 1989, this husband and wife team caused the deaths of at least 5 drifters. They became the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. Ray was 76 years old. Faye was 69. Ray Copeland was born in Oklahoma in 1914. He dropped out of school early and spent his younger years bouncing between petty offenses. By 1939, he had already been sentenced to prison for stealing livestock and writing bad checks. It was a pattern that followed him for decades. He married Faye in the early years and they had 5 children together. Money was always tight. Ray kept getting arrested for the same incidents over and over. Cattle theft, fraud, bad checks. By the 1980s, Ray had been banned from buying livestock himself because of his long offense history. That is when he came up with a plan. He started hiring drifters and homeless men, young guys in their 20s with no family looking for them. He would bring them to his farm and promise them work and a place to stay. Then Ray would have these men open bank accounts in their own names. He would write bad checks using their accounts to buy cattle from local farmers. The livestock would be sold quickly for cash, and then the men would disappear. Ray would take them out to a barn. He would use a .22 caliber Marlin rifle, 1 gunshot to the back of the head. The individuals affected were Dennis Murphy, Wayne Warner, Jimmy Dale Harvey, John Freeman and Paul Cowart. All of them were in their 20s. All of them were transient workers just trying to survive. Faye was not just a bystander. She kept a detailed list of the hired men. She wrote their names down on paper. Next to some of the names she marked an X. Those were the ones who had been unalived, and she did something else that shocked investigators. Faye took the clothing from the deceased men and sewed them into quilts that she kept in the house. In August 1989, an anonymous tip came into Crime Stoppers. A former worker named Jack McCormick told authorities about human remains on the Copeland farm. He said he had nearly been taken from life himself. Police were doubtful at first but decided to check Raz's lengthy offense record. In October 1989, officers arrived with bloodhounds and a search warrant. They searched the property for a week. They found 3 bodies buried in a barn on the Copeland property. A few days later, they searched another barn that Ray had recently purchased. 2 more bodies were found. All 5 men had been unalived with the same weapon. The .22 caliber rifle was recovered from the Copeland home. Investigators also found the list Faye had written and the quilts made from the individual's clothing. Both were arrested and charged with 5 counts of first-degree offense. Faye went to trial first in November 1990. The prosecution argued she was a full participant. The quilt and the list proved she knew exactly what was happening. The jury found her guilty on all 5 counts. She was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Ray was tried separately and also found guilty on all counts. He received the death sentence as well. They made history as the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in America. Ray Copeland passed away in prison in 1993 before his sentence could be carried out. Faye remained on death row for years. In 1999, her sentence was commuted to life in prison. In August 2002, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Governor Bob Holden granted her medical parole in September 2002. She was moved to a nursing home in Chillicothe, Missouri. Faye Copeland passed away there in 2003 at the age of 82. She left behind 5 children and 17 grandchildren. The exact number of individuals affected by the Copelands may never be known. Investigators believe there could be more, but only 5 bodies were ever recovered from that farm in Missouri.
Alton Coleman and Debra Brown terrorized the Midwest in the summer of 1984. For 53 days straight, this couple left a trail of terror across 6 states. 8 people were taken from life, 7 were assaulted, 3 were kidnapped, 14 armed robberies took place. By the time they were caught, the FBI had put them on their 10 most wanted list. Alton Coleman was born on November 6, 1955 in Waukegan, Illinois. He grew up in extreme poverty. His mother worked 3 jobs and was also involved in other activities to make money. Alton never knew his father. He had a difficult childhood filled with instability. By his teenage years, he had already been in trouble with the law multiple times. Debra Brown was born on November 11, 1962. She came from a more stable family, but had intellectual challenges. She had an IQ of around 59. Debra met Alton when she was in her early 20s. She fell completely under his control. Friends and family said she changed after meeting him. She became willing to do anything he asked. The spree began on May 29, Loveland. Alton had already been arrested earlier that year for assaulting a 14-year-old girl in Illinois. He was out on bond when he and Debra decided to run. Their first individual affected was 9-year-old Vernita Wheat from Kenosha, Wisconsin. Alton had befriended Vernita's mother and gained her trust. He took Vernita under the excuse of buying her candy. Her body was found weeks later in Waukegan, Illinois. She had been assaulted and strangled. Next came Waukegan, Illinois, a distant relative of Vernita. On June 18, the couple caused her death in Waukegan. They stomped her and strangled her. On June 28, they harmed Donna Williams in Gary, Indiana. Donna was 7 years old. They also attacked her 9-year-old friend Annie. Annie survived. Donna did not. In early July, the couple moved to Ohio. On July 5, they took the lives of Virginia Temple and her 9-year-old daughter Rochelle in Toledo. Both were assaulted and strangled. 2 days later, on July 7, they caused the death of Tawny Story in Cincinnati.
Tawny was a 15-year-old girl. On July 11, Alton befriended an elderly woman named Marlene Walters in Norwood, Ohio. She was 77 years old. He convinced her to let him into her home. He and Debra attacked her with a wooden candlestick. She passed away from her injuries. Her husband Harry found her body when he came home. The couple stole the Walters car and drove to Dayton. On July 13, they took Harry Walters' life in Dearborn County, Indiana. Harry was 77 years old. A massive manhunt was underway. Their faces were on the news every single day. Police received tips from multiple states. On July 20, 1984, a couple in Evanston, Illinois recognized them from news reports. They called the police. Alton and Debra were arrested without incident in a park. Multiple states wanted to try them. Ohio went first. In 1985, both were found guilty of causing the deaths of Tawny Story and Marlene Walters. They were both sentenced to death. Indiana tried them next. They were convicted of harming Donna Williams and Annie. Both received death sentences again. Illinois also convicted them and gave them more death sentences. Over the next few years, Debra Brown had her death sentences commuted to life in prison. Courts considered her low IQ and the fact that she was under Alton's influence. She remains in a correctional facility in Ohio serving multiple life sentences. Alton Coleman was not as fortunate. On April 26, 2002, he was taken to Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. He was put to death by lethal injection. He was 46 years old. He never showed remorse. In his final statement, he said he was ready to leave this world. The 53-day spree had finally come to an end, 18 years later.
Gwendolyn Graham and Cathy Wood became known as the Lethal Lovers. They were nurses' aides who worked at Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, Michigan. Between January and April 1987, they caused the deaths of 5 elderly patients. They smothered them with washcloths and pillows. They turned it into a twisted game. They tried to choose individuals whose initials would spell out words. Gwendolyn was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree offense and sentenced to life without parole. Cathy testified against her and received a sentence of 20 to 40 years. She was released from prison in 2020. Gwendolyn Gail Graham was born on August 6, 1963. She grew up in Texas and had a difficult childhood. Her mother was reportedly abusive. Gwendolyn moved to Michigan in 1986 looking for a fresh start. She got a job at Alpine Manor as a nurse's aide. Catherine May Wood was born on March 7, 1962. Cathy had been working at Alpine Manor for some time when Gwendolyn arrived. Cathy was actually Gwendolyn's supervisor on the floor. The two women met in 1986 and quickly became close friends. Within weeks they became lovers. Cathy left her husband and moved in with Gwendolyn. Their relationship was volatile and intense. Friends said it was a toxic situation. They would fight and make up constantly. Gwendolyn was reportedly controlling and abusive toward Cathy. At some point in late 1986, Gwendolyn suggested they do something to bond them together forever. Something that only the two of them would know about. She wanted to cause the death of a patient at the nursing home. Cathy claims she thought Gwendolyn was joking at first, but Gwendolyn was serious. She convinced Cathy it would be exciting, that it would be their secret, that it would prove their love for each other. On January 18, 1987, they took the life of their first individual. Her name was Marguerite Chambers. She was 60 years old and suffered from Alzheimer's disease. Gwendolyn smothered her with a washcloth, while Cathy stood watch. Marguerite's death was ruled as natural causes. No one suspected anything. The second individual was May Mason. She was 79 years old. She also had Alzheimer's. Gwendolyn smothered her in February 1987. Again, it was ruled as a natural death. The third was Myrtle Luce. She was 95 years old and suffered from dementia. She passed away in the same way in February 1987. The fourth individual affected was Edith Cook. She was 98 years old. Gwendolyn took her life in April 1987. The fifth and final person was Belle Burkhard. She was 74 years old. She passed away in April 1987. All 5 individuals were elderly. All 5 had Alzheimer's disease or dementia. They were vulnerable and unable to defend themselves. Gwendolyn and Cathy chose them because they thought no one would question their deaths. They tried to pick individuals whose first initials would spell out the word murder, but they could not find patients with the right initials, so they gave up on that plan. The relationship between Gwendolyn and Cathy began to fall apart in late 1987. They broke up. Cathy moved back in with her husband Ken, but Gwendolyn would not leave her alone. She kept calling. She kept showing up at Cathy's house. Cathy was terrified. In September 1988, Cathy told her ex-husband Ken what had happened at the nursing home. Ken did not believe her at first, but Cathy kept talking about it. She said she was afraid Gwendolyn would take her life too. Ken finally went to the police.
On October 4, 1988, investigators began looking into the deaths at Alpine Manor. They exhumed the bodies of some of the individuals affected. But too much time had passed. There was no physical evidence of smothering. The cases relied entirely on Cathy's testimony. Gwendolyn was arrested in Texas, where she had moved after leaving Michigan. She was extradited back to Michigan to face charges. Cathy agreed to testify against Gwendolyn in exchange for a reduced sentence. The trial began in September 1989. Cathy took the stand and described everything. She said Gwendolyn was the one who did the smothering. She said she only stood watch because she was afraid of Gwendolyn. She said Gwendolyn had threatened to take her life if she told anyone. The prosecution argued that Cathy was just as guilty. She had been there. She had done nothing to stop it. She had not reported it for over a year. But Cathy's testimony was crucial. Without it, there was no case. Gwendolyn was found guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree offense. She was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. She is currently housed at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Pittsfield Charter Township, Michigan. She will never be released. Cathy Wood pleaded guilty to 1 count of second-degree offense and 1 count of conspiracy to commit second-degree offense. She was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in a correctional facility. On January 16, 2020, Cathy Wood was released from prison. She had served 31 years behind bars. She was 57 years old at the time of her release. She moved to Fort Mill, South Carolina. The families of the individuals affected were outraged. Retired Police Sergeant Roger Kaliniak, who investigated the case, said he feared Cathy would harm someone again. He called her a serial offender who could not be trusted. The case of Gwendolyn Graham and Cathy Wood remains one of the most disturbing in Michigan history. 2 women who were supposed to care for vulnerable elderly people instead turned them into individuals affected in a sick game. 5 lives were taken. 5 families were left with unanswered questions. And one of the perpetrators walks free today.
Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate were teenage lovers who went on one of the most shocking sprees in American history. In just 8 days during January 1958, they caused the deaths of 11 people across Nebraska and Wyoming. Charles was 19 years old. Caril was only 14. Charles was put to death in the electric chair in 1959. Caril was sentenced to life in prison. She was paroled after 17 years. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska. He was the 3rd of 7 children. His family was poor and struggled to make ends meet. Charles was small for his age and had bowed legs. He was teased constantly at school. He became angry and resentful. He dropped out of high school and worked as a garbage collector. Charles admired James Dean and tried to dress and act like him. He had a fascination with firearms and hunting. Caril Fugate was born on July 30, 1943, in Lincoln. She came from a working-class family. She met Charles when she was just 13 years old. He was 18. They started dating in 1956. Her parents did not approve of the relationship. Charles's first individual affected was Robert Culvert. On December 4, 1957, Charles went to a gas station where Robert worked. Robert was 21 years old. Charles robbed the station and forced Robert to drive to a remote area outside town. Charles shot him in the head with a shotgun. He left the body in an abandoned storm cellar. Robert's body was not discovered until January 27, 1958. Charles went to Caril house. Her mother, Velda Bartlett, and stepfather, Marion Bartlett, told him to leave and stay away from their daughter. Charles became enraged. He shot both of them with a .22 caliber rifle. Then he took Caril 2-year-old half-sister Betty Jean and strangled her. He hid the bodies in an outhouse and chicken coop behind the house. Caril claims she was not there when it happened. She says Charles told her they were being held hostage. She stayed in the house with him for nearly a week. They put up a sign that said everyone was sick with the flu. Family members came by, but Charles and Caril turned them away. On January 27, Caril grandmother called the police. Officers came to the house and found the bodies. Charles and Caril had already fled. They drove to the farmhouse of 70-year-old August Meyer. August was a family friend who lived in Bennett, Nebraska. Charles shot him in the head with a shotgun. Their car got stuck in mud, so they abandoned it and started walking. On January 27, they came across 17-year-old Robert Jensen and 16-year-old Caril King. The 2 teenagers were parked in a rural area. Charles forced them at gunpoint to drive to an abandoned storm cellar. Robert was shot 6 times. Caril was shot once in the head. Both were found deceased the next day. Charles and Caril stole Robert's car and drove to Lincoln. On January 28, they broke into the home of wealthy industrialist C. Lauer Ward. C. Lauer was 47 years old. His wife Clara was 46. Their maid Lillian Fenkel was 51. Charles stabbed C. Lauer multiple times. He shot Clara and Lillian. All 3 were found deceased in different parts of the house. Charles and Caril stole the Ward family's black Packard and drove west toward Wyoming. By now their faces were all over the news.
A massive manhunt was underway. On January 29, they were near Douglas, Wyoming, when their stolen car got stuck. Charles flagged down a passing car driven by 37-year-old salesman Merle Collison. Merle was asleep in his car on the side of the road. Charles shot him 9 times. A local man named Joe Sprinkle stopped to help. He did not realize what was happening at first. Charles tried to take Joe's car, but Joe fought back. Caril ran toward a police car that was driving by. She screamed that Charles was going to take her from life. Charles jumped in the stolen Packard and sped away. Deputy Sheriff William Romer chased him at speeds over 100 miles per hour through the streets of Douglas. Charles crashed the car and tried to run on foot. Officers surrounded him. He was arrested without further incident. Both were charged with first-degree offense. Charles went to trial first in May 1958. He claimed temporary insanity. The jury did not believe him. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On June 25, 1959, Charles Starkweather was put to death in the electric chair at Nebraska State Penitentiary. He was 20 years old. Caril Fugate was tried separately. She maintained that she was a hostage and had no choice but to go along with Charles. The prosecution argued she was a willing participant. The jury found her guilty of first-degree offense in the case of Robert Jensen. She was sentenced to life in prison. She became the youngest female ever convicted of first-degree offense in United States history. Caril served 17 years behind bars. In 1976, she was granted parole. She was released at the age of 32. She changed her name and tried to live a quiet life. To this day, the question remains: was Caril Fugate a willing accomplice or a terrified teenager held hostage by a violent offender? The truth may never be fully known.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley became the most infamous perpetrators in British history. Between 1963 and 1965, they caused the deaths of 5 children in and around Manchester, England. They abducted them, assaulted them, harmed them in unspeakable ways, then buried their bodies on Saddleworth Moor. They became known as the Moor's murderers. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Brady passed away in 2017. Hindley passed away in 2002. They never showed true remorse. Ian Duncan Brady was born on January 2, 1938 in Glasgow, Scotland. His mother was a single waitress who could not afford to raise him. He was sent to live with foster parents. Ian had a difficult childhood. He was smart but troubled. He became obsessed with books about violence and control. He moved to Manchester in 1954 to live with his birth mother and her new husband. He started working at a chemical company. Myra Hindley was born on July 23, 1942 in Gorton, Manchester. She came from a working-class family. She was close to her father. She worked as a typist at the same chemical company where Ian worked. They met in 1961. Myra was 18. Ian was 23. Myra fell completely in love with Ian. She wrote in her diary that she would do anything for him. Ian was cold and calculating. He introduced Myra to his obsessions: books about philosophy and control, recordings of speeches by certain leaders. He convinced her that some people were worth less than others, that they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. By 1963, they had decided to act on Ian's darkest fantasies. Their first individual affected was 16-year-old Pauline Reed. On July 12, 1963, Myra approached Pauline near her home in Gorton. Myra knew Pauline from the neighborhood. She asked Pauline to help her look for a lost glove on Saddleworth Moor. Pauline trusted her and agreed. Ian was waiting. Pauline was assaulted and then taken from life. Her body was buried on the moor. On November 23, 1963, they targeted 12-year-old John Kilbride. John was at a market in Ashton-under-Lyne. Myra offered him a ride home. Ian was in the car. They drove John to the moor. He was assaulted and strangled. His body was buried there. On June 16, 1964, they took 12-year-old Kith Bennett. Kith was on his way to visit his grandmother in Longsight. Myra offered him a ride. Ian was waiting. Kith was taken to the moor. He was assaulted and taken from life. His body was buried but has never been found. On December 26, 1964, they abducted 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey. Leslie Ann was at a fair in Ancoats. Myra lured her away with the promise of helping carry shopping bags. They took Leslie Ann to Myra's house. What happened next was recorded on audio tape. Ian and Myra harmed the child while recording her cries for help. Then they took her to the moor and caused her death. Her body was buried there. On October 6, 1965, they took the life of 17-year-old Edward Evans. Edward was their only male individual who was not a child. Ian met him at a train station in Manchester. Ian invited him back to the house. Myra's brother-in-law David Smith was there. Ian attacked Edward with an axe in front of David. He struck him over a dozen times. David was horrified. He helped clean up the scene, but only because he was terrified. The next morning, David went to the police. On October 7, 1965, officers arrived at Myra's house with a search warrant. They found Edward's body wrapped in plastic in a bedroom. They arrested Ian and Myra immediately. During the investigation, police found photographs of Myra posing on the moors. They found the audio recording of Leslie Ann Downey begging for her life. They found notebooks with plans and details. They searched the moors and found the bodies of Leslie Ann Downey and John Kilbride buried in shallow graves. The trial began on April 19, 1966 at Chester Assizes. It lasted 14 days. The prosecution presented the audio tape of Leslie Ann. The courtroom was silent. People wept. Ian showed no emotion. Myra claimed she was forced to participate. She said she was afraid of Ian. The evidence showed otherwise. On May 6, 1966, the jury found Ian Brady guilty of causing the deaths of John Kilbride, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. He was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences. Myra Hindley was found guilty of causing the deaths of Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans. She was also convicted of harboring Ian after he took John Kilbride's life. She received 2 life sentences plus 7 years. The United Kingdom had abolished the death penalty just months before their arrest. If the timing had been different, they would have been put to death. For years Ian and Myra refused to admit to taking the lives of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett. In 1985, the investigation was reopened. Ian finally confessed to both incidents in 1987. Myra also confessed. Police searched the moors again. In 1987, they found Pauline Reed's body. Keith Bennett's body has never been found. His mother Winnie Johnson spent the rest of her life searching for him. She passed away in 2012 without ever knowing where her son was buried. Ian Brady was moved to Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital in 1985. He went on a hunger strike in 1999. He wanted the legal right to starve himself. The courts denied his request. He was force-fed for years. Ian Brady passed away on May 15, 2017. He was 79 years old. He never apologized. He never showed remorse. Myra Hindley remained in a correctional facility for 36 years. She claimed she found religion. She claimed she was sorry. Many people did not believe her. The families of the individuals affected fought to keep her behind bars. Myra Hindley passed away on November 15, 2002. She was 60 years old. She passed away from respiratory failure at West Suffolk Hospital. The case of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley remains the most notorious in British history. 5 children taken from life. 5 families destroyed.
and one body still missing on those cold, dark moors. Cynthia Coffman and James Marlow went on a deadly road trip across multiple states in just a few months. They caused the deaths of at least 4 women. They kidnapped them, robbed them, assaulted them, and strangled them. Both were sentenced to death in California in 1990. Cynthia became the first woman to receive a death sentence in the state since capital punishment was brought back in 1960. James Marlow passed away on death row. Cynthia remains there today. James Gregory Marlow was born in 1957 in rural Stearns, Kentucky. He grew up with his younger sister Veronica and his mother Doris Hill. His childhood was unstable and difficult. By the time he was an adult, James had a long offense history. He had been in and out of correctional facilities for years. He was violent and manipulative. Cynthia Lynn Coffman was born on January 9. She came from Missouri and had a troubled past. She was divorced and working low-paying jobs when she met James. Cynthia first encountered James in May 9. Her boyfriend at the time was housed at Folsom State Prison in California. James was there too. The two men knew each other. After James was released, he contacted Cynthia. They started a relationship almost immediately. Cynthia left her life behind and moved in with James. Friends said she became completely obsessed with him. She would do anything he asked. The spree began in July 1986. James and Cynthia were in Whiteley County, Kentucky when they targeted Gregory Hill. Gregory was taken from life for financial gain. His body was found on Upper Mulberry Cemetery Road about a tenth of a mile from his home. Police did not connect it to James and Cynthia at the time. On October 11, 1986, they kidnapped 32-year-old Sandra Neelley from Costa Mesa, California. Sandra was working at a dry cleaning business. The couple forced her into their vehicle. They drove her to a remote area. She was assaulted and strangled. Her body was found days later. On October 28, 1986, they targeted 35-year-old Pamela Simmons from Bullhead City, Arizona. Pamela was approached at a gas station. She was taken against her will. She was found deceased in the desert. She had been strangled with a cord. On November 7, 1986, they kidnapped 20-year-old Corinna Novus from Redlands, California. Corinna was working at Prime Cleaners. James came into the store pretending to be a customer. He and Cynthia forced Corinna into their car at gunpoint. They drove her to a remote location in the mountains near Big Bear. Corinna was assaulted and strangled. Her body was found in the woods. On November 14, 1986, they took 19-year-old Linnell Murray from Huntington Beach, California. Linnell was grabbed outside a mall. She was forced into their car. She was driven to the desert near Indio. She was assaulted and strangled. Her body was discovered in the sand. The motive was always the same: money. James and Cynthia would steal the individual's credit cards and identification. They would use the cards to buy clothes and gas. They would empty bank accounts. They treated their targets like ATM machines. On November 14, 1986, the same day they took Linnell's life, police in Riverside County pulled over James and Cynthia for a traffic violation. Officers ran their names and discovered they had outstanding warrants. When police searched the car, they found a loaded revolver and ammunition. They also found Linnell Murray's identification card in Cynthia's purse. They found credit card receipts with Linnell's forged signature. They found an earring that matched the one still in Linnell's ear when her body was found. Police also found clothing and money stolen from Prime Cleaners where Corinna had worked. A search of their motel room at the Bavarian Lodge in Big Bear revealed more stolen items. James and Cynthia were arrested immediately. They were charged with multiple counts of offense, including kidnapping, robbery, assault, and causing death. The trials took place in 1989 and 1990. Cynthia claimed she was a person affected by battered woman syndrome. She said James controlled her completely. She admitted to being present during the incidents but claimed she was forced to participate. The prosecution argued she was an equal partner. The evidence showed she helped lure the individuals. She helped restrain them. She helped steal their belongings. The juries in both trials found her guilty. On August 30, 1989, Cynthia Coffman was sentenced to death in San Bernardino County for the case involving Corinna Novus. She became the first woman sentenced to death in California since 1977. She received a second death sentence in Orange County for Linnell Murray's case in 1990. James Marlow was also found guilty in both trials. He received death sentences as well. He never showed remorse. He blamed Cynthia for some of the incidents. He said she was jealous and violent. James Marlow passed away on death row of natural causes. The exact date of his death is not widely publicized. Cynthia Coffman remains on death row at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She has been there for over 30 years. California has not put anyone to death since 2006. The state has a moratorium on the death penalty. Cynthia continues to appeal her sentence. She maintains that she was under James's control and that she suffers from trauma.
But the families of Sandra, Pamela, Corinna, and Linnell will never get their loved ones back. 4 young women taken from life for nothing more than credit cards and cash.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg became the most famous married couple ever put to death in United States history. They were not accused of causing anyone's death. They were convicted of espionage, of passing atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. On June 19, 1953, both were put to death in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in New York. They maintained their innocence until the very end. Julius Rosenberg was born on May 12, 1918 in New York City. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Russia. He grew up poor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Julius was a bright student and attended City College of New York, where he studied electrical engineering. He graduated in 1939. Ethel Greenglass was born on September 28, 1915, also in New York City. She came from a similar background. She worked as a clerk after graduating high school in 1931. Ethel met Julius in 1936 at a meeting for labor activists. Both were heavily involved in leftist political movements. They were members of the Communist Party. They married in 1939 and had 2 sons together. Michael was born in 1943 and Robert in 1947. During World War II, Julius worked as an engineer for the United States Army Signal Corps. He was fired in 1945 when his Communist Party membership was discovered. After the war ended, the United States and Soviet Union entered the Cold War. Nuclear weapons became the most important secret in the world. In February 1950, a scientist named Klaus Fuchs was arrested in England. Fuchs had worked on the Manhattan Project. He confessed to passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. His confession led investigators to Harry Gold. Gold was a chemist who worked as a courier for Soviet intelligence. Gold's confession led the FBI to David Greenglass. David was Ethel's younger brother. He had worked as a machinist at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the atomic bomb was being developed. David told investigators that Julius had recruited him to steal information. He said Julius would pass sketches and documents to Soviet contacts. David also claimed that Ethel typed up his handwritten notes to make them easier to read. On July 17, 1950, Julius was arrested at his apartment in New York. He was charged with conspiracy to commit espionage. Julius denied everything. He refused to provide any names or admit any wrongdoing. On August 11, 1950, Ethel was arrested after testifying before a grand jury. The FBI had limited evidence against her. Some believe she was arrested as leverage to make Julius talk. It did not work. Both remained silent. The trial began on March 6, 1951 in federal court in New York City. Judge Arvin Coffman presided. The prosecution's main witnesses were David Greenglass and his wife Ruth. David testified that Julius recruited him in 1944. He said Julius gave him money and instructions on what information to steal. David described how he would pass sketches of bomb components to Julius during family visits. Ruth testified that Ethel was present during some of these meetings. The most damaging testimony was about the typing. David claimed Ethel typed up his handwritten notes in their apartment in September 1945. Julius and Ethel both took the stand. They denied all charges. They invoked their Fifth Amendment rights when asked about their Communist Party membership. The trial lasted less than a month. On March 29, 1951, the jury found both Julius and Ethel guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage. On April 5, Judge Coffman sentenced them both to death. He said their offense was worse than causing someone's death. He blamed them for the Korean War and for putting the atomic bomb in Soviet hands. Morton Sobel, another defendant in the case, was sentenced to 30 years in a correctional facility. David Greenglass received 15 years for his cooperation. There were worldwide protests. Many believed Ethel was innocent. Some thought the death sentence was too harsh. Appeals went all the way to the Supreme Court. President Harry Truman refused to grant clemency. President Dwight Eisenhower also denied their final appeal. On June 19, 1953, Julius and Ethel were put to death at Sing Sing prison. Julius went first. The first electric shock ended his life. Ethel went second. Her case was more difficult. After 3 electric shocks, doctors found her heart was still beating. She was given more shocks until she passed away. They left behind their 2 young sons. Michael was 10 years old. Robert was 6. The boys were adopted by family friends and given a new last name. For decades, the case remained controversial. Were they guilty? Were they framed? In the 1990s, declassified documents from the Soviet Union confirmed that Julius was involved in espionage, but the evidence against Ethel was much weaker. David Greenglass later admitted he lied about Ethel typing the notes. He said he did it to protect his own wife. Ethel may have known what Julius was doing, but there is little proof she actively participated.
The Rosenbergs remain the only American civilians ever put to death for espionage during peacetime.
Judith Ann Neelley and Alvin Howard Neelley were a married couple who committed some of the most brutal incidents in Alabama and Georgia history. In 1982, they kidnapped, harmed, and caused the deaths of 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken and 22-year-old Janice Chapman. Judith became the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States. She was only 18 years old when she committed the offenses. Her death sentence was later commuted to life in prison in 19. Alvin cooperated with authorities and avoided the death penalty. He received a life sentence and passed away in prison in 2005. Judith Ann Adams was born on June 7, 1964. She came from a troubled home in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. She met Alvin Howard Neelley when she was only 15 years old. Alvin was born on July 15, 1953. He was 9 years older than Judith. They married in 1980 when she was just 15 and he was 27. Friends and family said Alvin had complete control over Judith. She was young and impressionable. Alvin had a history of offenses including theft and fraud. He was manipulative and abusive. By 1982, the couple was living a transient lifestyle. They moved from state to state. They had 2 young children with them. Alvin convinced Judith to help him with various schemes, robbery, fraud, and eventually worse. On September 25, 1982, Judith approached 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken at the Riverbend Mall in Rome, Georgia. Lisa was there with friends. Judith pretended to be friendly. She told Lisa she was looking for someone to babysit her children. She offered Lisa money. Lisa trusted her and agreed to go with her. Judith took Lisa to a motel where Alvin was waiting. For 3 days, Lisa was held captive. She was assaulted repeatedly. She was mistreated in ways that are difficult to describe. On September 28, Judith drove Lisa to Little River Canyon in DeKalb County, Alabama. Judith attempted to cause Lisa's death by injecting her with liquid drain cleaner using a syringe. When that did not work, Judith shot Lisa in the back with a firearm. Then she pushed the child over the edge of the canyon. Lisa's body was found at the bottom of the gorge. She had been taken from life in the most horrific way imaginable. Just weeks later, on October 4, 1982, the couple targeted 22-year-old Janice Chapman and her fiancé John Hancock in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Judith approached Janice at a shopping center. She used the same babysitting story. Janice and John were lured to a motel. Alvin shot John multiple times. John survived the attack. Janice was not as fortunate. She was taken to Georgia where she was assaulted and shot. Her body was found on October 5 in Floyd County, Georgia. On October 9, 1982, Judith was arrested in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, on unrelated charges involving forged checks. 2 days later, Alvin turned himself in. He immediately began cooperating with police. He told investigators everything. He claimed Judith was the one who actually caused the deaths. He said he was afraid of her. The prosecution did not believe him. The evidence showed Alvin was the mastermind. He was older. He had the offense history. He was the one in control. But Judith was the one who physically harmed the individuals affected. Judith went to trial first in 1983. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The details that came out were shocking. The jury heard about what happened to Lisa in that motel room. They heard about the drain cleaner. They heard about the gunshot in the canyon. The defense argued that Judith was under Alvin's control. They said she was a person affected by abuse. She was young and brainwashed. The jury found Judith guilty on all counts. They recommended a sentence of life in prison without parole, but Judge Randall Cole overruled the jury. He sentenced Judith to death by electric chair. At 18 years old, she became the youngest woman on death row in America. Alvin was tried separately in Georgia for the case involving Janice Chapman and John Hancock. He pleaded guilty and cooperated fully with authorities. He testified against Judith. He avoided the death penalty and received a life sentence. He was sent to Bostick State Prison in Hardwick, Georgia. Judith spent years on death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Wetumpka, Alabama. In January 1999, Governor Fob James commuted her death sentence to life in prison. The decision was controversial. Many people were outraged. The families of Lisa and Janice felt betrayed. The commutation made Judith eligible for parole. In 2003, the Alabama legislature passed a law stating that commuted death sentences should automatically mean life without parole, but the law was challenged and later overturned. Judith has had multiple parole hearings. In 2018, 2023, and most recently in 2025, she has been denied parole each time. The families of her individuals affected continue to fight to keep her behind bars. Alvin Neelley passed away in prison on October 21, 2005. He was 52 years old. Judith remains in a correctional facility in Alabama. She is now 60 years old. She has been behind bars for over 40 years. Her next parole hearing is scheduled for 2028.
The question still remains whether the 15-year-old girl who married Alvin was a person affected or a willing participant. But one thing is certain: Lisa Ann Milliken and Janice Chapman lost their lives in the most brutal way imaginable, and their families will never get them back.